hold on a second. How can we decide this without having to determine what it means to engage in an insurrection? How do we get there? How does an individual state make this conclusion and still have the Constitution protected? This is not a good sign for the Colorado decision.
Is whether the justices will issue a wide or a narrow ruling. What does that even mean?
Sometimes you walk out of oral argument not knowing what the court's going to do. Maybe the justices are asking hard questions to both sides. Sometimes you walk out knowing how this is going. And this really...
And they also talked about the possibility that, well, if one state, one pivotal swing state disqualifies a candidate, that could swing the election of the president who serves the entire country. So as much
who gets to decide? Is it the state like Colorado? And part of that was about the authority, which authority has it. And it seemed at the beginning.
Well, I'm mainly listening, Bill, for whether the court seizes on what I think are the strong textual and procedural reasons not to get into the question of whether an insurrection even occurred, let alone whether President Trump participated in it.
If they let Colorado disqualify Donald Trump, then we could have a scenario where some states disqualify a candidate and others don't. And that would be a problem politically, practically. And they also...
A narrow ruling might just address the fact that the Colorado decision was on the primary rather than on the general. Might just address Colorado rather than issuing a ruling that would apply to all of the states. I think the notion of like a narrow ruling that would potentially, and I know that there are people making this argument, but that would leave some of this back to the states. I don't think that would be good for the country. I don't think it's good for there to be this uncertainty that's going to be playing out over months. That's my own personal view. So I would be surprised if the Supreme Court kind of let something play out that was so narrow that it allowed all of these political actors in all of the states to sort of fill the gaps. But that's what folks are talking about.
And this really feels like 7, 8, maybe even all 9 justices for a very narrow holding that Colorado by itself can't disqualify a candidate for the presidency without touching what a federal court could do, without touching what Congress could do, without touching what states could do to members of Congress, to senators. And I think what we heard in the oral argument over and over again was justices from across the ideological spectrum, for better or for worse, saying this really shouldn't be up to Colorado. Of course, Jake, then the question becomes what happens next? What is left for enforcing the insurrection ban in Section 3 against someone who a lot of people believe violated it?
Into is whether this even applies to the president at all. Justice Brown Jackson actually had a great argument in favor of Donald Trump to say that Section 3 doesn't even apply to the president at all, but they haven't really honed in on that. As you mentioned, they hone in on basically a states' rights issue, and it's been the left-leaning judges that have really tried to ask questions indicating that they might think that this is a states' rights issue, which is really surprising because that's normally a conservative position to take.
That was surprising.
Yeah, I don't think it's gonna be their ultimate conclusion, but it's interesting that that's the direction that they're taking us.
That obviously is the most electric, most controversial issue here. But I think there are very good reasons looking at the text of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment and the fact that in Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, what the drafters said was that it was for Congress, not the states, Congress, to enact procedures to enforce the provisions of the 14th Amendment. I think they're going to home in on the text and the procedures because that, I think, has more of a chance of getting a consensus among the 9 justices. I think it's probably very important to Chief Justice Roberts and the court as an institution to speak as much with one voice in this case as they can. I think the way you do that is stay out of the insurrection factual stuff, which is very controversial, and decide this on the text of the statute and the procedures.
It should be a unanimous ruling, and I think it should be a unanimous ruling. Based on some of the questions, it's hard to tell. You know, the whole point of an oral argument is to argue out the points and hash them out. So I think that's what the justices are doing. So it's hard to judge if they're actually leaning one way or the other, or if they're just hashing out their own argument. But I still think it should be a unanimous ruling, but, you know, it might not be. I don't know.
Well, you know, a lot of people are looking at what's happening here and saying, well, you know, let the voters decide as well. Like, why are we deciding someone's disqualified even before they have been put in?
So 2 things. Let's show the map here of call for number 2. This is a map showing the states that have this under consideration, right? Colorado and Maine have acted. The rest of the states there in yellow have all of this pending.
And Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, Jonathan Turley, I'm just going to read it here and then have you maybe break it down into regular people speak. It says, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president who, having previously taken an oath, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. What was this amendment meant for, and how does it apply today?
Well, I think you're going to hear a lot of discussion about that historical context to understand its meaning. This was written after a civil war in which hundreds of thousands of people died. You had a confederacy that had its own army, navy, foreign policy, and currency. And the members of Congress were not thrilled to see a former vice president of the Confederacy standing in line to take the oath again, the oath that he had violated before that Civil War. And they put an end to that, at least potentially, in this amendment. But that context is going to weigh very heavily. Many of us believe that this theory is just wrong on the text, wrong on the history. It also happens to be incredibly dangerous. But the court is really culturally inclined to have the smallest footprint possible at these moments. And they have three primary questions here. Is the president subject to this provision? Does the provision automatically apply, or does it need some type of act of Congress? And then finally, was this an insurrection? Now, what we're going to be listening for is particularly Chief Justice Roberts. He's going to want to eke out a heavy majority, if not a unanimity on the court. That's going to mean trying to find something that obviously all of these justices can agree on. That may be the question of whether this is automatic or not. It is less likely to be whether this was an insurrection. But I think that most of us anticipate that the court will look at this rather dimly, that down this road lies madness. If you allow states to do this, a single state under our electoral college system could effectively bar a candidate.
Yeah, I think it only makes him more determined. You know, Donald Trump is one of the most passionate, resolved people I've personally had the privilege to know. And I think he looks at what's going on, and it just makes him more determined than ever to correct the wrongs that are happening in our country. And he has these historic wins. You look at his campaign. His campaign is flying high. The American people love him. He's growing in support day by day. And that is so encouraging. And he sees that as confirmation that the American people support him despite what Jack Smith and all of these others now, you know, the Colorado Supreme Court, what they're throwing at him. He looks at him and he looks at all of this situation and says, okay, the American people are behind me. I'm doing this for the American people, so I'm going to keep going.